At my sister's wedding, the lights were blinding, the chandeliers dripping with crystals, and 200 guests shimmered in their gowns and tuxedos. Yet I wasn't part of it. I sat outside in the corridor on a chair, meant for staff or forgotten relatives. The heavy doors cracked just enough that I could hear the laughter and clinking glasses inside. A waiter slid past me with silver trays, and the smell of filet mignon and garlic butter filled the air. My stomach tightened when my own mother appeared, balancing a plate scraped clean from someone else's table. She didn't smile. She didn't even lower her voice. "A useless child deserves scraps," she said flatly, setting the cold leftovers on my lap. My sister Olivia followed, dressed in white lace, eyes gleaming like she owned the world. She rolled her eyes at me, pathetic. As always, the laughter inside didn't stop. To them, I was invisible. To her, I was entertainment. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile. My fingers slid beneath the rim of the plate, steadying myself before I stood. The air outside the ballroom was icy compared to the warmth inside, and it seeped straight into my bones. I thought I would leave. I thought I would let them keep their show, their golden child, their perfect family picture. But the universe has its way of flipping the script at the precise moment. Just as I turned, a woman in a midnight blue gown, elegant, powerful, her diamond earrings catching the light, froze mid-step. Her eyes locked on me. Her voice cracked the air, trembling with shock. "CEO, what are you doing here?" The words echoed louder than any music. Inside, the band faltered, the violinist's bow sliding across strings with a screech. Guests whispered, heads turned toward the hall. My mother's face drained of color. Olivia's grip on her champagne glass trembled until liquid sloshed over the rim. For the first time in my life, they looked afraid of me. I sank back into my chair, feeling the weight of every year I had carried their rejection. Chicago's most prestigious hotel ballroom, glittering like a palace, became the stage for my humiliation, and now for something else. They had always wanted me invisible, but shadows can hold power. I let my hand rest against the plate of scraps, the food stone cold. It reminded me of every birthday where Olivia blew out candles on a cake, while I got a single candle stuck in a muffin. Every Christmas morning she unwrapped gifts while I was handed a sweater worn by cousins before me. Every Thanksgiving when she sat at the center of the table and I was told to sit near the kitchen sink because Olivia needs space. This night was only another version of the same story. But it was the last time. I watched Olivia bask in the glow of her guests through the crack of the door. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, garlands of orchids spilling across polished floors. Champagne towers glistened like frozen waterfalls. Olivia's gown, rumored to cost $12,000, shimmered beneath the lights, each bead a reflection of my family's favoritism. My parents paraded her like royalty, and me, exiled to the hall with crumbs. Excluded just as I had been all my life, but humiliation has a way of burning into resolve. I pressed my palm against my thigh and thought they wanted me erased. Tonight I'll remind them I exist. I kept my face calm. My mother leaned into Olivia, whispering something that made her smirk, then both glanced at me as though daring me to cry to leave. I didn't. Instead, I met their eyes, my smile steady, my silence louder than their cruelty. Around me, guests began to murmur. A man in a tux asked softly, "Isn't that Natalie Carter?" Another voice followed, hushed but urgent. "Isn't she the CEO of that tech company in New York?" I closed my eyes, briefly inhaling, so the secret wasn't so secret anymore. The very thing I had kept from them, the success they swore I'd never reach, was unraveling in whispers all around their perfect ballroom. When I opened my eyes again, the groom himself had paused mid-sentence on stage. His gaze swept across the hall, lingering on me in the shadows. His voice broke over the microphone. I just need to say," he stuttered, then glanced again, recognition flashing in his eyes. Guests leaned forward, sensing something more. Olivia shifted uncomfortably, tugging his sleeve, her smile stiffening. My mother's knuckles whitened around her champagne glass. For the first time, I wasn't the one trembling. My heart pounded, but not from fear. It was the pulse of long-buried anger finally finding breath. 29 years of injustice and betrayal condensed into this night. For years I had been told I was nothing. For years I had been given leftovers while Olivia feasted. But tonight the tables would turn. Tonight they would taste their own silence. I leaned back in my chair, calm, almost serene, because I knew something they didn't. The truth had been waiting quiet, patient, ready to erupt. And I wasn't going anywhere until it did. The bride's mother-in-law still stood frozen in the doorway, her hand clutched over her chest, eyes wide at me. "CEO," she whispered again, disbelief trembling in her throat. The entire ballroom hushed. Champagne flutes hovered mid-air. Even the chandeliers seemed to still. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. Olivia's eyes darted between me and her groom, her face paling beneath layers of makeup. For once I was no longer their invisible child. For once they were the ones who looked small, and deep down I smiled because I knew this was only the beginning. The whispers from the ballroom hadn't faded when I sank back into my chair, plate of cold scraps still balanced on my lap. The sting of my mother's words clung to me like smoke. A useless child deserves scraps. I let my fingers toy with the edge of the plate, staring at the half-eaten steak, the limp asparagus, the greasy smear of sauce someone else had pushed away. My chest tightened, not from hunger, but from the old familiar ache, the one that came every time they reminded me I didn't belong. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 100th. My mind drifted backward, unspooling memories I had tried for years to bury. I was 8 years old again, sitting at the corner of our dining table, a single cupcake in front of me with one crooked candle. The wax dripped onto the frosting while my parents laughed with Olivia at the other end of the table, surrounded by balloons-wrapped boxes stacked like towers. "It's Olivia's birthday month," my mother said, brushing me off, when I asked why mine was so small. "We can't afford 2 big celebrations." But somehow there was always enough money for Olivia. At Thanksgiving, the golden child sat at the center of the table, her chair pulled close to the roasted turkey, while I was told to take a spot near the sink because Olivia needs space for her friends. I remember the smell of stuffing and cranberries, the sound of laughter rolling across the table while I balanced a flimsy plate on my knees. Invisible, disposable. Christmas was worse. Olivia squealed as she unwrapped a shiny new bicycle, the red paint gleaming under the twinkling lights. My gift, a sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs, the sleeves too long, because it had already been worn by my cousins. I smiled anyway because I learned early that showing disappointment only earned me more scorn. Favoritism wasn't a secret in our house. It was a doctrine. Olivia was the star. My parents paraded her talents, bragged about her beauty-filled photo albums with pictures of her smiling at piano recitals, her trophies gleaming. I was barely in the background, usually holding someone else's coat. When guests came, my mother would say, "Olivia is destined for greatness," while glancing at me with a sigh, and "Natalie should be grateful for what little she has." I learned quickly that gratitude meant silence. When Olivia struggled with math, a private tutor appeared at the door the next day. When I begged for help with my science project, my father chuckled and said, "Not everyone is meant for success." His words sank into me like stones. Olivia thrived under their constant praise, their endless protection. When she failed, excuses were made. When I failed, blame was mine alone. Even in small things, the extra slice of pie, the front seat of the car, the better bedroom, it always belonged to Olivia. I grew up on scraps, not just of food, but of love. And yet here I was 29 years old, still treated as the family's shame. Excluded, even on the night meant to showcase family unity. My sister's wedding, my mother's triumph, my father's silence, my humiliation. I let my gaze drift back through the crack of the ballroom door. Olivia spun across the dance floor, glowing, her veil fluttering as guests clapped to the rhythm of the band. My mother's face gleamed with pride, her hand clasped with my father's as they toasted their guests. I could see the glint of champagne, the flash of camera bulbs. And me, I sat outside with a plate of someone's half-eaten dinner. It might have crushed me once. It might have made me cry, made me run to my room and bury my face in my pillow. But not tonight. Tonight the humiliation carved itself into something sharper, something useful. They think I'm still that girl, I whispered to myself, voice low enough no one else could hear. But shadows can hold power. I remembered every manipulation, every injustice that shaped me. The stories my mother told relatives that I was lazy, ungrateful, a burden. The way she twisted truth into poison, painting me as the problem child so Olivia could shine brighter. Guests would nod sympathetically as my mother sighed, "Natalie just doesn't have Olivia's spark." And I would carry trays of drinks to those same guests, pretending not to hear. My family didn't just ignore me, they rewrote me. I learned to survive in silence, to hide my achievements, to grow in the dark. It was safer that way. Because every time I dared to stand tall, my mother found a way to cut me back down. She would laugh. "Don't embarrass yourself," whenever I spoke about my dreams. Olivia smirked. "You'll never measure up." Those voices lived inside me for years, echoing whenever I tried to believe in myself. But something happened when I finally stopped listening. Something changed when I built my life outside their reach. I watched Olivia raise her glass, her smile frozen but radiant under the chandeliers. The golden child, the perfect bride, the one they believed deserved everything. She had no idea that her storybook ending was already cracking. And my mother standing tall, confident, certain her manipulation had succeeded once again. She had spent her life feeding me lies that I was nothing, that I would never succeed, that my only worth was in comparison to Olivia. She had believed those lies so deeply, she never looked for the truth. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. I pressed my palm against my thigh, steadying the storm inside me. For years, I swallowed their betrayal, thinking silence was survival. Tonight, I would let them taste that silence themselves. A man near the doorway glanced at me, whispering to his wife, "Isn't she the CEO of Carter Innovations?" My heart skipped, but I kept my face calm. Another woman leaned closer to her friend, murmuring, "That's Natalie Carter?" I read about her in Forbes. The rumor was spreading. Like fire catching dry grass, it leapt from guest to guest, whispers building into a wave of speculation. My mother turned her head sharply, eyes narrowing at the sound. Olivia glanced nervously around, her smile stiffening, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. My father shifted in his seat, suddenly restless. I smiled to myself, small and steady. They wanted me invisible. But now, without me lifting a finger, the truth was crawling into their perfect party. I leaned back in the chair, crossing my legs, letting the scraps on my lap go cold. My humiliation had transformed into something else entirely, an ember glowing hotter with every murmur from the ballroom. This wasn't the first time they tried to erase me, but it would be the last. The ballroom glittered like a cathedral of glass, but all I could feel was the hush that had settled after those first whispers, "CEO, Carter Innovations." The words wound their way through sequined gowns and polished tuxedos, a ripple of disbelief that grew with every second. My mother's smile tightened, her jaw rigid as she tried to laugh it off with guests leaning in too close. Olivia's hand fluttered nervously at her gown as though straightening beads that didn't need fixing. And I sat in the shadows of the hall, letting their discomfort soak into me like a long-awaited rain. Funny how strangers knew me better than my own family. 4 years ago, Carter Innovations was just an idea in a cramped apartment. Now it stood as one of the fastest-growing firms in New York, the kind of company magazines splashed across glossy covers with headlines about resilience and grit. They called me the youngest Iron Lady, praised me as a decisive boss, though I never thought of myself that way. To me, I was simply Natalie Carter, someone who had clawed her way out of invisibility and built a fortress so her mother's words could never reach her again. Inside that ballroom, though, I was still the useless child. My mother had told that story so many times she believed it herself. She spun it for relatives, for neighbors, for anyone who would listen. Olivia is the golden one, she'd say, placing a hand on my sister's shoulder like crowning her queen. Then she'd glance at me almost with pity. And Natalie? Well, she struggles. Even my father had gone along with it, nodding quietly, sipping his scotch as though silence absolved him of betrayal. He never corrected the lie. Never once defended me when the family smirked at my supposed failures. That silence carved deeper wounds than any words could. I thought about the last family Christmas before I cut ties. Olivia had paraded her diploma across the living room, my mother glowing with pride. I stood in the doorway holding a small box of cookies I had baked on my own dime, a token gift. My mother had sneered cookies. Is that all you've accomplished? I left that night without saying goodbye. And yet tonight my name had returned to them, not as shame, but as whispers of respect. I remembered the first time a team of interns at Carter Innovations called me Boss Carter. The word had startled me foreign on my skin. I had smiled awkwardly, but the young man who said it, Daniel, looked at me with pure respect. You don't understand, he had said. You believed in me when no one else did. That's what makes you a boss. Now, as I sat in the hall, I lifted my gaze to the groom on stage. Daniel. His lips trembled over the microphone, his eyes darting back to me again and again. I had mentored him through late nights, fought to keep his job when others wanted him fired. He had become one of my brightest directors. And tonight, he was also Olivia's groom. The irony twisted inside me like a knife. My sister was about to marry a man who already knew my truth, who had seen me in boardrooms, not ballrooms, who had heard my voice steady when entire projects were collapsing, who had trusted me with his career. He knew what I was capable of. He knew the lies my family told were only that, lies. But did Olivia know? Did my parents? Of course not. They never asked. They never cared. Daniel's voice cracked into the microphone. I want to thank my family, he stammered, but his gaze remained locked on me, his words stumbling. Guests tilted their heads, whispering. My mother's laugh rang out too loud, desperate, like glass about to shatter. I leaned back against the chair, closing my eyes for a moment. They think I'm still that girl, the one sitting by the sink at Thanksgiving, the one with a single cupcake on her birthday, the one wearing hand-me-down sweaters on Christmas morning. They thought humiliation would break me forever. But they didn't know I had built an empire from the very silence they forced on me. The truth pressed at the edges of the ballroom, waiting to explode. Olivia's perfect fairy tale was already cracking, and my mother's tight grip on her narrative was slipping. I could almost hear her words from years ago. Don't embarrass us, Natalie. Don't talk too much. Don't try too hard. Olivia carries this family's name, not you. Those words had branded me like fire. Tonight, I would return them. The chandeliers glowed above Olivia as she smiled, stiffly clutching Daniel's arm. She had no idea that her golden image was seconds from tarnish. My mother's posture was rigid, a woman used to control suddenly losing it. My father shifted, tugging at his tie, his silence louder than ever. And me, I sat with my plate of scraps, finally unafraid. I thought of Carter Innovations again, of the first office I rented, the peeling paint, the second-hand desks. Of the nights I stayed awake, balancing numbers, wondering if payroll would clear. Of the meetings where investors looked at me, a young woman alone, and smirked until I proved them wrong. Every bruise from my childhood had become steel in those rooms. Every rejection had become fuel. The very things my family thought would ruin me had built me instead. Daniel's eyes flickered once more toward me. He faltered mid-sentence, the words catching in his throat. The crowd shifted, sensing tension. Olivia tugged at his sleeve. Smile, she hissed through her teeth, her lips never breaking their painted curve. But Daniel didn't smile. He swallowed hard, staring at me, as if the weight of two worlds pressed on his shoulders, the world of Olivia's lies and the world of my truth. I drew in a breath, steady. This was no longer about crumbs on a plate or cold leftovers. This was about the story they had written for me versus the one I had written for myself. Tonight the two narratives were colliding. I tilted my chin, letting him see it in my eyes. The unspoken challenge. The truth he already knew. His hand shook as he gripped the microphone tighter. "Before I thank my bride," he began, voice low, strained, "I need to acknowledge someone else in this room." Olivia's head whipped toward him, confusion flashing across her perfect face. My mother's eyes widened, her knuckles whitening on her glass. My father's breath caught in his chest. The room leaned forward, and I sat perfectly still, my plate of scraps cooling on my lap, my pulse steady, waiting for the confrontation to begin. Daniel's voice cracked against the microphone, the words tumbling over themselves as he tried to steady his breath. "Before I thank my bride." He stopped, his gaze jerking once more toward the hallway where I Saturday. The silence in the ballroom deepened, stretching tight like a wire about to snap. Guests leaned forward. Forks hovered above plates. Even the band, caught mid-note, quieted down the last echo of a violin hanging brittle in the air. Olivia's smile froze on her lips, her fingers digging into Daniel's arm with a little too much force. My mother shifted in her chair, her laughter, too loud a brittle sound no one joined. I sat straighter, letting their stares wash over me. My expression was calm, almost serene, but inside my chest the years of humiliation beat like a drum. They wanted me silent. They wanted me erased. Tonight their own stage would betray them. For a moment Daniel's eyes faltered, as if he was fighting two sides of himself, the groom clutching vows in one hand, the protégé who still remembered me standing by him in a boardroom when no one else believed in him. I didn't blink. I let him see the steadiness in me, the steadiness my family had tried to strip away but failed. The whispers began again. "Isn't that her? The CEO, I saw her on the cover of Business Weekly. What's she doing here if they treat her like this?" Olivia's laugh rang out suddenly, too high-pitched, too sharp. "He must be nervous." "It's just stage fright," she said, her voice carrying across the tables, desperate to recapture the room. She tugged Daniel closer. "Go on, darling." But Daniel's hand trembled as he gripped the microphone tighter, and his eyes never left mine. I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to breathe slow. I had learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting, that calm could cut deeper than rage. For years they had painted me as weak, incapable. Tonight I would let the truth paint itself. And as I sat there, the past began to creep in, the years I had tried to forget, rising like smoke. I was 18 again, suitcase in hand, acceptance letter to a small state college, clutched like a lifeline. My parents stood in the kitchen, arms crossed. My mother shook her head, lips curled. "We've already given so much to Olivia's future. You'll have to figure this out yourself." My father said nothing. His silence was his weapon. I left that day with $40 in my wallet, and the taste of rejection bitter in my throat. While Olivia moved into a new apartment paid for by them, I moved into a dorm with peeling paint and 3 roommates. While Olivia posted photos of her new car on social media, I caught buses at midnight to scrape plates in diners and shelve books in libraries. 3 jobs, 7 days a week, just to keep tuition covered and the lights on. I remember sitting in the campus library, hands shaking, as I counted coins to afford a cup of coffee that would have to last me through a night of studying. I remember staring at textbooks until my eyes burned, whispering to myself that I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching me fail. And every phone call home ended the same. "Olivia just won another award," my mother would say, pride dripping from every syllable. "What about you?" When I told her about my grades, my part-time jobs, the exhaustion clinging to me like a second skin, she laughed softly. "Some people just aren't meant for success." I clenched my jaw in the hall, the memory as sharp as broken glass. They had called me a burden, an embarrassment, a child unworthy of love. They had erased me at every turn, rewriting the narrative so Olivia shone brighter. But those years forged me. Those years taught me discipline, grit, survival. Those years were the steel beneath my skin now. Back in the ballroom, Olivia adjusted her veil, her smile cracking at the edges. My mother's glass rattled as she set it too hard against the table. My father tugged at his tie, his silence suddenly heavy with unease. I let the smallest smile curve at the corner of my lips. They had no idea what was coming. I remembered the moment that changed everything, the professor who saw me, who handed me an internship application and said, "You have a mind sharper than most. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." That internship became my first real foothold. That foothold became a job. That job became a company. Carter Innovations was born out of the scraps they left me. Out of rejection, out of betrayal, out of nights they never thought I would survive. The truth was a blade, and tonight it was already cutting. Daniel's voice cracked again. I need to say. He stopped, eyes darting between Olivia and me. His hesitation was its own confession. Guests leaned into one another, whispers swelling into a wave. Olivia's face stiffened, her knuckles white around her bouquet. She hissed into the microphone, forgetting to cover it. "What's wrong with you?" Daniel's lips pressed tight, his jaw clenching. I let my gaze rest on him steadily, and for a moment his eyes softened. He remembered. He remembered the night he nearly lost his position at Carter Innovations, the night he thought his career was over. He remembered me standing by him, speaking up when no one else would. He remembered the second chance. And I knew then the story they had crafted for me, the story of failure, of worthlessness, was unraveling thread by thread in front of 200 guests. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, the murmur of the crowd seeping into me like fuel. The girl they left with nothing became the woman they cannot ignore. And I'm done staying silent. When I opened them, Olivia was staring at me, fury sparking in her eyes. My mother's lips moved, a hiss. I couldn't hear, but I could imagine. "Don't you dare ruin this." The irony made me want to laugh. They had spent their entire lives ruining me. Now all I had to do was sit still and watch as their own lies did the rest. Daniel raised the microphone again, his shoulders tense, his voice low but firm. "Before I thank my bride?" He stopped, glanced back at me once more, and the entire ballroom held its breath. I leaned forward, placing the untouched plate of scraps on the empty chair beside me. My hands rested lightly on my knees, my body calm though my heart thundered. The storm was coming, and this time I would not run. Daniel's hand shook as he brought the microphone closer, his knuckles, pale under the spotlight. "This woman." His voice faltered, eyes finding me in the hallway again. "She's not just my bride's sister, she's my boss. She's the CEO of Carter Innovations. Without her, I wouldn't even be standing here tonight." The ballroom erupted. Gasps echoed against the marble floors. Champagne glasses clinked, silverware rattled, and voices tangled into disbelief. Guests leaned across tables, whispering in shock. My mother's face turned rigid, her smile cracking like porcelain under pressure. Olivia's hand froze mid-gesture, bouquet trembling as if she might drop it. "Your boss," a man in a tux repeated loudly, unable to hide his shock. "She's the CEO." Daniel's words hung heavy in the air, undeniable and sharp. My mother forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "What a silly mix-up. My daughter Natalie has always exaggerated her place in the world." She turned toward the crowd, waving her hand as if she could brush away the truth like dust. "He must mean someone else." But Daniel's voice carried over hers, firm now. "No, I mean her. Natalie Carter saved my career." He glanced at me again, something like respect softening his expression. Olivia's lips trembled. "What are you talking about, Daniel? Don't." The whispers swelled louder. A woman near the front gasped. "I've read about Carter Innovations. That company's been in Forbes, hasn't it?" "Yes," another voice replied. "Youngest CEO in New York? Natalie Carter. That's her." Every eye in the room swung toward me. He didn't flinch. I sat in the hall, calm, composed, while my family's carefully built narrative began to splinter. My mother leaned close to Olivia, her voice a hiss, but still audible to guests nearby. "Stay composed. Don't let this spiral." But her knuckles were white as she gripped the back of Olivia's chair. The groom swallowed hard and lowered the microphone slightly. His gaze traveled through the crowd, landing back on me. He was about to say more, I knew. The weight of memory pressed on him, the truth waiting to be told. 4 years earlier, Daniel had been a nervous intern barely clinging to his job after a disastrous mistake on a major project. Executives had demanded his dismissal, claiming he wasn't reliable. I remembered standing in that boardroom, the long table filled with judgmental faces, the young man sweating bullets at the end. They were ready to cast him out. But I had seen something in him, creativity, potential, buried under fear. I'd told the room he deserves a second chance. A mistake isn't a death sentence. Innovation comes from risk, and risk sometimes fails. My voice had silenced the murmurs. Against opposition, I gave him that chance. Daniel had looked at me then with wide, grateful eyes. From that day forward, he called me Boss Carter, never with sarcasm, but with respect that felt heavier than any title on a business card. I'd guided him through nights of revisions, coached him until his ideas gleamed. And he had grown into a leader, standing now in a tuxedo, clutching a microphone at his own wedding. And he was marrying Olivia. The irony pressed against my ribs until I almost laughed. "I can't let this lie continue, Daniel," said, now his voice steadier, his shoulders squaring as though he had made a decision. "She's the reason I'm here. Without her, there would be no career, no foundation for me to stand on." The ballroom buzzed with disbelief. Guests twisted in their chairs to stare at Olivia, whose smile was collapsing into panic. Olivia raised her voice, sharp, shrill, desperate. "He's confused. Natalie probably threatened him, manipulated him somehow. That's what she does. She clings to other people's success." The words cut through the room, but instead of nods of agreement, Olivia was met with widened eyes and doubtful whispers. "Threatened him? Doesn't sound like what we've just heard." I felt my mother's gaze stab at me like daggers. She mouthed silently. "What game are you playing?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was already speaking for me. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his silence louder than my mother's protests. He wouldn't meet my eyes, and I knew why. His quiet compliance had been the glue that held their manipulation together. He had never defended me, never corrected their lies. His cowardice was as much betrayal as their cruelty. "Daniel," Olivia snapped, her voice cracking, "now you're humiliating me. Stop it." But Daniel looked at her, then at me. His lips pressed into a firm line. Humiliation comes from lies, and lies are crumbling tonight. Olivia's bouquet slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a muffled thud. Gasps rose again. The ballroom was unraveling, a performance breaking apart in front of 200 witnesses. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, my expression unreadable. Inside, my chest was burning with something hot and sharp, not rage anymore, but justice rising. Guests murmured louder. So the golden daughter wasn't the only success in this family. What else have they been hiding? Every word, every glance was a crack in my family's facade. My mother tried to stand, her heels clacking against the marble, her voice high and desperate. "This is absurd. My daughter Olivia is the pride of our family. Natalie has always been, but she stopped. Because the room wasn't listening to her anymore. They were looking at me." Daniel placed the microphone gently on the table and bowed his head slightly toward me, a gesture of acknowledgement, so subtle yet undeniable. I tilted my chin, my smile quiet but sharp. I didn't need to speak. The tide had already turned. Then Olivia snapped, her voice echoing through the speakers as she screamed into the microphone. "Stop embarrassing me." The sound crashed through the ballroom, bouncing off chandeliers and glass. Gasps filled the silence that followed. The perfect bride had shattered her mask. The room froze. The groom's mother covered her mouth. Guests exchanged stunned glances. My mother's face went white. And I sat in the hall, finally no longer invisible, watching, as the lies began to devour themselves. The ballroom froze after Olivia's scream, her voice still echoing in the chandeliers as though the crystals themselves were vibrating with her rage. She stood on the stage, clutching the microphone like a weapon, her face flushed red under the lights. Guests stared, their whispers now louder, more doubtful, the illusion of the perfect bride unraveling seam by seam. I sat in the hall, the cold plate of scraps forgotten on the chair beside me. My hands were steady on my lap, my breathing even. I had no need to rush. They were doing the unraveling for me. Olivia's laugh rang out, suddenly brittle and jagged. "Don't listen to her," she snapped, pointing the microphone toward me like a dagger. "She's nothing. She's always been nothing. She's not a real CEO, she's just a fraud who clings to other people's success." A hush swept the crowd. My mother shot to her feet, her voice shrill, desperate. "Exactly, Natalie has always been manipulative. She twists stories, makes herself look like a victim. Don't be fooled." The guests shifted uncomfortably. A man in the front row whispered, "But didn't the groom just say she was his boss?" A woman leaned to her companion, frowning. And I read her profile. Forbes featured her last month. Olivia's eyes darted across the crowd, panic creeping into her expression as she realized she wasn't convincing them. Her voice grew higher, more frantic. "She begged me for money in college. She couldn't even survive without me. Everything she has is because of my leftovers." That word again, leftovers. I let it slide across me like a blade that could no longer cut. My lips curved faintly, but I stayed silent. The silence was power. I could feel it in the air, the way guests were watching me, waiting for me to lash out, to scream back. Instead, I sat still, my calmness a mirror, reflecting Olivia's unraveling hysteria. Every frantic word she spoke, every lie she spun, turned back on her. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at her side, his hand reaching for the microphone, but Olivia yanked it closer to her chest. Her hair clung to her damp forehead as she glared at me. "You see," she cried, her voice cracking, "she's pathetic. That's why she sits out there in the hall instead of with us. Because she doesn't belong." The guests' whispers were louder, now pointed, questioning. One woman muttered audibly, "Or maybe she was pushed out. It looks like the family excluded her." Excluded. The word landed heavy, and I could almost see the recognition flicker through the faces in the crowd. They weren't blind anymore. They were seeing it, the favoritism, the toxic family dynamic that had ruled my life since I was a child. I closed my eyes, briefly, memory sliding in uninvited. I was 19, standing in the bursar's office at college, tears burning behind my eyes as the clerk shook her head. "Without the payment, we can't enroll you for next semester." I had called my parents that night, begging for help. My mother's laugh rang in my ear. "We're already paying for Olivia's exchange program in Paris. You'll have to figure it out yourself." I hung up and sat in the dark, the weight of injustice pressing down on me until I thought I might suffocate. Later that night, I spooned instant noodles from a chipped bowl, telling myself I could survive on less. That scraps could be enough, but scraps had forged me into steel. Back in the ballroom, Olivia's voice wavered, growing shriller. "She's jealous of me. She always has been. That's why she's trying to ruin my wedding." Gasps rose. A guest shook his head. "Jealous? She's the CEO of a company. What would she be jealous of?" The murmur spread like fire. Olivia's chest heaved, her perfect facade dissolving under the weight of doubt. My mother clutched her arm, trying to steady her, but her own face was pale, her control slipping away. I kept my silence. Every second I refused to defend myself, Olivia condemned herself more. Then Daniel moved. He placed a hand on Olivia's arm, his voice calm but firm. "Enough." He tried to take the microphone, but Olivia yanked it back, desperation wild in her eyes. "Daniel, don't you dare defend her," she shrieked. "She's nothing compared to me." And then in a single breath, Daniel broke the spell. "She's the reason I have a career at all," he said, his words carrying through the speakers though he didn't hold the mic. "Without her, I wouldn't even be here. That's the truth." The ballroom erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices rose in disbelief, in sympathy and recognition. Olivia's body went rigid, her face crumpling in rage. "No!" she screamed. "Don't you see? She's manipulating you all." "That's what she does. Manipulation lies betrayal." Her mother's hand clamped over her wrist, trying to drag her back into her seat. But the damage was done. The perfect bride had turned into a spectacle, her voice ringing with hysteria for all to hear. I opened my eyes, slowly let them meet Daniel's. His expression was heavy, conflicted but sure. He knew, and he wanted me to speak. He stepped forward closer to the hall where I sat, and placed the microphone gently on the edge of a table. "Tell them," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the stunned ballroom. "Tell them the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. All eyes turned to me. Olivia shrieked, panic breaking into her tone. "Don't you dare, Natalie. Don't you say a word." I sat still for one heartbeat, longer, feeling the weight of their fear press against me, like chains I had worn my whole life. Then I lifted my hands from my lap, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and stood. Every head in the ballroom turned. Olivia's face twisted in horror. My mother's lips parted, breath caught. My father stared at the floor, silent as always. I stepped forward, leaving the cold plate of scraps behind. My voice hadn't yet broken the silence, but already the air vibrated with the storm about to come. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I stepped into the ballroom, the air heavy with anticipation. 200 eyes followed me, the whispers dying, until the silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. Olivia's face twisted in fury, her hands trembling as she clutched the microphone. "Sit down," she screeched, her voice cracking through the speakers. "Don't ruin my wedding." I stopped at the edge of the dance floor and looked at her. My voice was calm, even soft, but it carried. "It seems I've been ruining your spotlight just by existing." Gasps rippled through the guests. Olivia's knuckles whitened around the mic, her lips trembling with rage. My mother rose halfway from her chair, panic in her eyes. My father sat frozen, staring at the tablecloth as if it held the answers to a lifetime of silence. I drew a breath and let my gaze sweep across the room. "You've heard my sister call me pathetic. You've heard my mother call me useless. Tonight I'll tell you my side of the story." The ballroom hushed, as though the chandeliers themselves leaned in to listen. I felt the weight of years pressing on my chest, but my voice didn't shake. When Olivia went to Paris on an exchange program, her tuition, her apartment, her expenses were all paid by my parents. Meanwhile, I was working 3 jobs, living off instant noodles and wondering if I could pay for next semester. When she got a new car, I was waiting for buses at midnight after closing down the diner. When she showed off designer gowns, I was patching holes in second-hand sweaters. Olivia snapped back, her voice shrill. "Lies. She's jealous, that's all. She never accomplished anything." I turned my head toward her, my expression steady. "If I were jealous, I wouldn't have built a company from scratch. Carter Innovations employs hundreds of people who call me Boss Carter, not because I begged for respect, but because I earned it." The whispers swelled again, disbelief mingled with awe. A woman near the front clutched her pearls, murmuring, "That's her. I read about her in the journal. She's the CEO." Olivia's smile faltered, her composure slipping like sand through her fingers. My mother lunged for control, her voice pitched high. "She twists everything. Olivia was always the one with talent. Natalie just hides behind fabricated stories." I met her eyes and said evenly, "Talent isn't forged diplomas or staged awards. Talent is surviving betrayal and still standing." The words sliced the air cleanly, and for the first time I saw hesitation flicker in the eyes of guests who had once only admired Olivia. Their gaze shifted uneasy toward my mother. My father finally spoke, his voice weak, almost a whisper. "Maybe we should." But my mother silenced him with a glare so sharp it made him swallow his words. A man in a tailored suit stood from his table, clearing his throat. "I'm an investor. I know Carter Innovations. I met Natalie last year at a conference in New York." He turned slowly toward Olivia. "If she is a fraud, then why has her company been praised across our industry?" Applause erupted in a scattered wave, hesitant but real. My chest tightened. For so long I had begged for 1 ounce of recognition, 1 sliver of respect. Tonight it was pouring from strangers while my own family squirmed in shame. Olivia's voice cracked, trembling now. This is my night. This is supposed to be about me. I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving hers. It always has been about you, Olivia. Every birthday cake, every Christmas gift, every ounce of love and attention, they gave it all to you. And still, it's not enough. You wanted me erased. But I'm still here. Her face contorted, panic and rage warring across her features. Shut up, she screamed, but her voice only echoed her desperation. I turned from her, addressing the room again. For years I stayed silent, because speaking up meant being punished, being ridiculed. But silence is its own kind of prison. Tonight I won't stay silent anymore. The crowd leaned in. Phones lifted, recording, capturing every word. My mother's face paled, realizing control was slipping completely away. I ate scraps while my sister feasted. I was shoved into shadows while she was paraded as the golden child. My parents told the world I was worthless. But they were wrong. The truth is standing right here. The applause grew louder this time, firmer, echoing off marble and glass. I let it wash over me, not as vindication but as a release. Olivia clutched at Daniel's sleeve, her voice trembling. Tell them she's lying. Tell them she's trying to destroy us. Daniel looked at her, then at me. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His silence was its own confession. I faced Olivia once more. If you want to expose me, let's expose everything. The room gasped collectively. Guests shifted, pulling out their phones, eyes wide with anticipation. Olivia froze, her breath caught in her throat, panic radiating from her. I took a step closer, my voice low but carrying. You spent your whole life trying to paint me as pathetic. But tonight, Olivia, the world will see who you really are. The ballroom erupted with murmurs, energy crackling like lightning ready to strike. Guests leaned forward, hungry for the next revelation. And I stood tall in the center of it all, finally ready to turn every lie they'd ever told into the truth that would end them. The ballroom's air turned electric the moment my words hung there. If you want to expose me, let's expose everything. A hush fell so thick, I could hear Olivia's uneven breathing over the microphone. Her mascara was already smudging at the corners of her eyes, the panic she tried so hard to hide breaking through the cracks. I reached into my clutch, calm and deliberate, and pulled out my phone. Let's start with this. My thumb tapped the screen, and within seconds the projector that had been cycling through wedding photos flickered to black before lighting up with a scanned document. The bold university letterhead glowed across the ballroom wall. Olivia gasped. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice carrying into the microphone. The guests leaned forward, squinting at the words. At the bottom of the diploma, the registrar's signature looped in elegant cursive, but next to it a glaring red watermark appeared, invalid. Forgery detected. Gasps rippled like a wave. That's fake, someone whispered. Her Ivy League diploma was forged. Olivia's eyes went wide. She grabbed the microphone with both hands, shouting, "She's lying." She faked that document herself. I tilted my head, unbothered. Interesting, since this file was pulled from the university's own verification system. My voice was steady, but the undercurrent was sharp enough to cut glass. You never graduated from Princeton, Olivia. You paid someone to build you a story. And our parents funded it. The ballroom stirred, voices rising. Fraud, one man muttered. All those years she bragged about her degree. Olivia's hands shook so violently the microphone squealed with feedback. My mother bolted upright, eyes flashing. "Stop this nonsense," she barked. "Olivia worked hard for everything she has. Natalie is jealous and she's making things up." I lifted my chin and swiped again on my phone. Another file filled the screen, a bank transfer record, 6 figures, wired directly from the Carter Family Trust into Olivia's personal account. "This," I said, my voice cutting across the murmurs, "is where her tuition came from. Not merit, not scholarships. Fraud and favoritism." The crowd erupted. A relative from the groom's side stood pointing an accusing finger. So that's why my promised inheritance disappeared. Another hissed under her breath. They drained the family trust to fund a lie. The color drained from my mother's face, but Olivia lashed out blindly, her voice shrill. You wouldn't even have money if Mom didn't steal for me. The words burst out before she could stop herself. And in that instant, the entire ballroom froze. Then came the explosion, gasps, shouts, chairs scraping against the floor. Olivia's face blanched as she realized what she had admitted, her hand clapping over her mouth too late. My mother spun on her, furious. Do you hear yourself? She hissed, but it was already out there, irreversible. I let the silence linger for just a moment before I spoke again. Thank you, Olivia, for confirming everything I've kept quiet about for years. My voice was steady, controlled, the words delivered like a verdict. Guests turned on each other, the noise swelling. This is fraud. How could they betray their own daughter like this? She was excluded while they stole from her. I looked across the crowd, my gaze calm. They wanted you to believe I was pathetic, useless. They called me scraps. But the truth is that every luxury Olivia flaunted was stolen from me, from the trust from this family. A man in a dark suit pushed his chair back and stood. His voice was deep, authoritative. I'm a lawyer. With these documents, you could press charges for fraud, forgery, embezzlement. His eyes swept to Olivia and my mother. This is criminal. The ballroom buzzed, even louder, phones lifted everywhere, recording, flashing, capturing the downfall of the golden child and the mother who made her. Olivia shook her head, wildly, tears streaking her mascara. No, it's not true. She's doing this to humiliate me. I met her eyes and spoke quietly, the microphone no longer necessary. You did this to yourself. For a heartbeat, the only sound was her sobbing. Then another voice rose, bitter and sharp, from the groom's side. If she lied about her degree, what else is a lie? What about her career? Her so-called awards? I slid one final file onto the screen. A list of awards supposedly won by Olivia, each one marked in red with the word revoked or invalidated. The room erupted again. People stood pointing, muttering in disgust. It's all fake. Everything about her was fabricated. My mother's shoulders sagged as if the weight of years of lies had finally pressed her to the floor. Her lips parted, but no words came. I turned my gaze back to the crowd, letting the moment settle. For years I stayed quiet. I let them tell you I was worthless while they stole from me. But silence protects no one. Tonight the truth belongs to everyone. Applause began, hesitant at first, then louder, spreading until it filled the ballroom. Some clapped for justice, others for the courage of finally seeing the truth. Olivia collapsed to her knees on the stage, sobbing into the microphone, the sound distorted and pitiful. My mother stood frozen, her face ashen, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. I stepped closer to the center of the ballroom, my heels echoing against the marble. This wedding was supposed to be her perfect day. Instead, it is the day everyone finally sees who she really is. The chandeliers blazed overhead, their light sharp and merciless. Olivia's sobs filled the room. My mother's silence wrapped around her like chains, and the guests stared at me, not with pity, not with doubt, but with recognition. And for the first time in my life, I stood not as the forgotten daughter in the hall, but as the one who had finally brought the truth into the light. Daniel stood frozen beside Olivia, his face pale, the microphone dangling uselessly from his hand. The ballroom was chaos, guests whispering fiercely, phones held high, the screen behind him, still glowing with the red watermark of forged diplomas and fraudulent transfers. Olivia was on her knees, clutching the hem of her gown, sobbing into the mic, as if desperation could erase the truth. My mother's lips pressed into a thin white line, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. I stayed where I was, centered on the marble floor, my breath steady. But I could feel the weight of Daniel's eyes on me, heavy with the burden of choosing. Olivia grabbed at him, her fingers clutching his sleeve, smearing mascara across his crisp tuxedo jacket. Don't listen to her, she cried, voice breaking into ugly, high-pitched sobs. She's jealous. She always has been. You love me, right? Tell them, Daniel. Tell them she's lying. Tell them she's nothing. Her words trembled through the speakers, bouncing off chandeliers, making the silence afterward even harsher. Daniel looked down at her, his jaw tight. His hand hovered as if he wanted to comfort her, but it never landed. Instead, his gaze flicked back to me. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth already weighed on his shoulders. I saw the battle in his eyes, the pull between two worlds. On one side was the bride Olivia, the golden child, the woman he had promised to stand beside. On the other was me, the boss who had once stood for him, the woman who had given him a second chance when no one else would. The memory flashed across his expression like a shadow. A boardroom. Years ago, his voice shaking as he presented a flawed idea, executives sharpening their knives to cut him down. They had demanded his firing, but I had said, a mistake doesn't define potential. He deserves another chance. That moment had saved his career, and he knew it. Olivia's voice dragged him back to the present. She clutched at his wrist, now her nails digging into his skin. Please, Daniel, please tell them it's all lies. Don't let her destroy me. Don't let her destroy us. Her tears smeared down her face, her veil crumpled, her sobs echoing through the microphone. But even in her desperation, her words dripped with the same manipulation I had lived with my entire life. Daniel's lips parted. His voice was low, raw, but it carried through the still microphones. Lies, he said, looking at Olivia, are what have destroyed you. Gasps shot through the ballroom. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth. Chairs scraped as guests leaned closer. Olivia's head jerked back as if he'd slapped her. What? She choked. Daniel took the microphone from her trembling hands. His voice was steadier now, fueled by something stronger than fear. 4 years ago, I nearly lost everything. I was an intern with nothing to show but mistakes. Everyone wanted me gone. Everyone but her. He turned his eyes, meeting mine. Natalie Carter believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. She gave me a chance to prove I could do better. She saved my career. Without her, I wouldn't even be standing here tonight. The ballroom erupted. Murmurs swelled into shouts, then gasps. Phones caught every word. Olivia staggered backward, shaking her head. No, stop it. She doesn't care about you. She's manipulating you too. But Daniel's eyes were clear, his voice cutting through her cries. If anyone manipulated me, it wasn't Natalie, it was you. You lied about your degree, your career, even your image. You lied to me. And you expected me to stand here tonight and build a life on those lies. The room buzzed with outrage. She lied to her own fiancé, someone muttered loudly. What kind of marriage is that? Olivia's hands shook violently as she reached for him again. Daniel, please, you love me, you said so. Don't let her win. Don't throw me away. Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs that echoed like broken glass. Daniel closed his eyes, pain written across his face. Then he stepped back, letting her hands fall. I cannot marry someone built on fraud and manipulation. The words landed like thunder. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a wave of whispers, some sympathetic, most damning. Olivia's knees buckled, her body folding onto the marble floor. She let out a wail, raw and guttural, her hands clawing at the fabric of her gown, as if she could hold on to what was already gone. My mother rushed forward, crouching beside her, gripping her shoulders. Get up, she hissed, though the microphone still caught it. Don't you dare collapse like this. Stand up, smile. But Olivia sobbed harder, her body shaking. I stood still, watching. My hands were loose at my sides, my expression unreadable. Inside, though, a storm of vindication swirled. Daniel turned toward me once more. He set the microphone on the table, then bowed his head slightly, a gesture so simple yet so heavy. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but certain, for teaching me integrity. I stand with the truth tonight. The ballroom roared, with whispers, shouts, even applause. People rose to their feet, some clapping, others recording. The tide had turned completely. Olivia's cry rose again, her voice broken. You've stolen everything from me. I finally let myself speak, my tone calm, unshaken. No, Olivia. You lost everything by trying to steal what was never yours. The chandeliers blazed above us, their light merciless as Olivia's sobs filled the air. My mother cradled her fury, burning in her eyes, but her hands trembled. My father sat motionless, staring down at the tablecloth, as if the shame was too heavy to lift his head. And me, I stood tall, steady, as the lies that had buried me for decades collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. For the first time, the golden child's shine had gone dark, and justice, sweet, quiet justice, was finally mine. The ballroom had not yet recovered from Daniel's words. When I stepped closer to the center, the marble floor echoing under my heels. Olivia lay collapsed in her mother's arms, sobbing, her makeup streaked like ink on porcelain. My mother's face was rigid fury, radiating from her eyes, but her hands trembled as she clutched her daughter. My father sat still, head bowed, his silence as loud as any confession. This was never just about a wedding, I said, my voice carrying into the stunned quiet. This has always been about the truth. And it's time we finally tell the whole family story. The screen behind me flickered again as I raised my phone. The projector obeyed, filling the ballroom with the image of another document, the last will and testament of my grandmother, whose estate had been meant to secure both her granddaughter's futures. Gasps rose from the crowd. Words appeared on the screen to be divided equally between my granddaughters Natalie Carter and Olivia Carter. I turned my gaze toward my parents. This was her wish, equal. But somehow my share never reached me. Instead, it found its way into Olivia's accounts. Does anyone want to explain that murmurs rose immediately, sharper than before? So that's where it went, someone muttered from the groom's side. A cousin from my mother's family shot to her feet, pointing. You told us the trust was depleted because of market losses. You lied to all of us. My mother shook her head furiously. That's not true. She's twisting everything. Natalie never understood finances. But before she could finish, another file appeared on the projector, bank statements showing forged transfers, my signature clumsily replicated at the bottom. The crowd erupted again. A man shouted forgery. Another voice followed. This is fraud. My mother's face drained of color. Olivia moaned, trying to cover her ears, but the microphone still caught her sobs. I leveled my voice. For years they told you I was worthless. They said I had nothing, that I was jealous of Olivia. But the truth is they made me worthless on paper by stealing what was mine. All around me relatives whispered furiously, their voices growing sharper. We were manipulated. She betrayed her own child. That's injustice. I turned to my father, then his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. And you, I said quietly, you knew, didn't you? His chin trembled. For the first time that night, he raised his eyes to mine. Tears glistened in them, his voice breaking as he spoke. I knew. The words were small, strangled. I couldn't stop her. She would have destroyed me too. Gasps filled the room again. My mother turned on him, rage bursting across her face. Coward! You dare betray me now. But my father shook his head, voice trembling. I betrayed my daughter long before tonight. Every time I stayed silent, I betrayed her. The room stilled, the confession heavier than any proof. My chest ached, not from surprise, but from the deep cut of hearing him say it out loud after all these years. My mother lunged for the microphone Olivia had dropped. She clutched it with both hands, her voice ragged. I did it all for Olivia. She was the only one worthy. She deserved the best, and Natalie was always the weak one. What future could she have without me? I stepped forward, my gaze hard. No, you did it because you wanted control. Because favoritism was your weapon. You built a perfect doll out of Olivia and thought you could discard me like trash. Her voice cracked into a scream. And I was right, but the crowd's reaction proved otherwise. The ballroom erupted in disgust, the whispers no longer whispers but sharp condemnation. Shameful. Monstrous. What kind of mother does this? A man in a charcoal suit rose from his chair, his tone cutting. With these documents, this is open and shut. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement. Charges could be filed immediately. My mother's knees buckled slightly, her hands gripping the microphone as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. I took another step closer, my voice low but resolute. This was never about jealousy or failure. It was about theft. You stole my inheritance, my dignity, and years of my life. And tonight, in front of everyone, you've stolen your own mask. The applause began small, then grew louder, spreading from table to table until the ballroom thundered with it. My mother stood rigid in the spotlight, Olivia collapsed, and wailing, my father bent in shame. Inside me, a calm, spread like fire, finally cooling to embers. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't excluded. I was the truth standing in front of them. I faced the guests, my words clear. For years they said I was useless. Tonight, the only useless thing left is their lies. The applause rose again, louder, a storm of clapping hands and approving voices. My mother's grip on the microphone slipped, her knuckles trembling. Olivia sobbed into her palms. My father lowered his head once more, shoulders shaking with silent tears. And I stood beneath the chandeliers, taller than I had ever felt, as the world finally saw what I had always known, that the golden child and her keepers were nothing but shadows built on fraud. This was no longer their story. It was mine. The ballroom felt like a courtroom now, every guest a witness, every chandelier a spotlight. Phones hovered in the air, recording, capturing every second of the downfall. Olivia sat collapsed against my mother, her sobs filling the mic she had dropped. My mother's face was gray, her eyes darting wildly as if she could still claw back control. My father remained slumped in his chair, staring at the tablecloth, as though he could disappear into it. I stepped forward to the center of the floor. The marble gleamed under my heels, but my voice carried steadier than it ever had. For years I was told I was nothing. Tonight you all see the truth, I wasn't nothing. I was silenced. And silence doesn't erase a life, it only delays justice. The crowd erupted in applause, but I raised a hand, quieting them. I turned toward Olivia and my mother, their faces stricken, humiliated under the glare of 200 pairs of eyes. You thought betrayal would destroy me. You thought exclusion would erase me. But tonight it's your lies that have destroyed you, Olivia moaned, clutching at her gown. Stop, she whispered hoarsely, her throat raw from crying. Please stop. Daniel stood to the side, jaw tight, his eyes fixed on her with something colder than anger, disappointment. My mother shook Olivia's shoulders, hissing, Stand up, smile, don't let them see you break. But Olivia only shook her head, sobbing louder. I felt no triumph in her collapse, only inevitability. My gaze shifted to my mother. Tell me, mother, was it worth it? Was favoritism worth tearing this family apart? Was it worth branding me useless while you forged signatures and drained accounts to crown Olivia as your golden child? Her lips trembled, but no words came. I took another step closer. For every night you called me pathetic, for every holiday you pushed me to the corner, for every inheritance you stole, this is the moment you face the silence you forced on me. Gasps sounded again. Guests whispered fiercely. Karma, payback, justice. My mother's voice cracked. I did it for Olivia. She was the only one worthy. No, I said firmly. You did it because you craved control. Because manipulation was easier than love. Because you feared what would happen if I stood on my own. The applause thundered again. A guest in a dark suit rose from his seat. Natalie is right. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, this family's crimes won't be hidden anymore. His words landed like a gavel striking wood. Olivia wailed, clutching her face. You've stolen everything from me, I shook my head. No, Olivia. You lost everything by trying to steal what was mine. That's karma. My mother staggered back, her face pale. My father, finally lifting his head, spoke through tears. She's right. I failed you, Natalie. I should have defended you years ago. Forgive me. His voice cracked, breaking something deep inside me. I looked at him for a long moment. The pain of years of silence pressed against my chest. "Your silence hurt me more than their words," I said quietly. "But at least now it's broken." He bowed his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. I turned toward the guests again. "I don't need revenge. I need justice. And justice doesn't come from screaming at them, it comes from letting the truth speak." I gestured toward the lawyer who had already stepped forward. "The evidence is yours. Make sure it reaches the court." The man nodded gravely, tucking the files into his briefcase. The applause rose louder, now sweeping through the ballroom in waves. I breathed deeply. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. The chandeliers blazed above me, casting their merciless light on the fallen golden child and her mother, and for once I stood taller, steadier, the weight of betrayal finally sliding off my shoulders. I looked around at the crowd, my voice rising one last time. They said I was useless. Tonight I've proven the only useless thing left are their lies. The ballroom roared in agreement. Some stood and clapped, others shouted their support. The tide was complete. My mother slumped against a chair, Olivia still sobbing, my father broken in his shame. And me, I was no longer their scapegoat. I was the truth they could never silence again. The ballroom emptied slowly, the thunder of applause fading into the quiet hum of departing guests. A few lingered to press my hand, their eyes filled with sympathy, even admiration. "You were brave," one woman whispered before slipping out the door. Another clasped my arm and said justice finally caught up with them. Their words washed over me like waves, warm, steady, undeniable. I stood beneath the chandeliers, my chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. The marble floor that had once felt like ice beneath me now seemed solid grounding. Olivia was gone, carried out sobbing by my mother, who clutched her daughter like a shattered porcelain doll. My father trailed behind them, shoulders bent, unable to meet my eyes. The golden family image was in ruins, their perfect facade left in shards across the dance floor. When the last guest departed, I walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights glittered alive, unbothered by the chaos that had unfolded inside. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, calm, unflinching. For years I had begged for their respect, their acknowledgement. Tonight I realized I never needed it. What I needed was my own voice. The memories flickered through my mind: birthdays with single candles stuck in cupcakes, Christmas mornings with secondhand sweaters while Olivia paraded new gifts. Thanksgivings spent at the far end of the table, excluded from warmth, laughter. I had been told I was invisible, useless, a burden, and for so long I believed it. But tonight the lie crumbled. My phone buzzed in my hand, a message from the lawyer guest who had taken the evidence. "The documents are secure. Legal action will begin immediately." Relief spread through me like a tide, pulling away years of pain. The battle wasn't just mine anymore. The truth had been handed over, and justice would take its course. Behind me, Daniel approached quietly, his footsteps careful on the marble. "Natalie," he said softly, his voice steady but weighted. "I'm sorry this happened tonight, but I'm glad the truth came out." I turned to him, his tuxedo rumpled, his face tired but his eyes clear. "I didn't plan this," I said, "but it had to happen. Lies can't build a life." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "No, they can't." He glanced toward the doors where Olivia had vanished. Pain flickered across his face, but not regret. He had made his choice. He had chosen the truth. "I hope you find peace," I told him. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect I would never forget, and then he left, the doors closing behind him with a soft thud. Silence filled the ballroom, heavy but not suffocating. It was the silence of an ending. I gathered the scraps of my courage, the same scraps they had always left me, and walked outside. The city air was cold against my skin, but it felt like freedom. I crossed the street to the bridge that arched over the river, the lights of the city dancing on the water below. For a long time I just stood there, breathing, remembering, releasing. I thought of my father's broken voice. "Your silence hurt me the most. It was true. His silence had been the sharpest blade, the quietest betrayal. And yet even in that moment I didn't feel the need to hate him. The damage was done, but so was the hold it had over me. My mother's scream still echoed in my ears. She was the only one worthy, but those words no longer held power. Tonight the world had seen them for what they were: manipulation, control, lies. I would not carry them anymore. And Olivia, my sister. I thought of the little girl who once shared a bedroom with me, who used to sneak under my blanket during thunderstorms, whispering that she was scared. Somewhere along the way, she had become my rival, my enemy, the golden child molded by favoritism, until she could no longer tell truth from lies. I didn't know if she would ever recover from tonight, but I knew I would not fall with her. Instead, I would rise. The idea had been growing in me for months, but tonight it became clear. I would start something new, not just for me, but for others who had been silenced, excluded, cast aside by their families. The Second Voice Foundation, a place for students abandoned by favoritism and injustice, for young people told they were worthless, for anyone who needed a second chance. I could take the pain they had given me and turn it into power. The cold wind swept through my hair as I leaned against the railing of the bridge, the city alive around me. They gave me scraps, I whispered the words escaping into the night, and I turned them into strength. A small smile touched my lips. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by bitterness. I was light. This was my rebirth. And as I turned to leave, walking into the bright noise of the city, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: their betrayal had shaped me, but it would never define me again. This was my story. Betrayal, injustice, and finally, justice. And if you've ever felt excluded, underestimated, or silenced, I want to know what part of my journey spoke to you most. Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because here your voice will always matter.